and Doctors of BC are committed to partnering with Indigenous communities and walking together on the journey of cultural safety in the healthcare system. They've been focusing on learning opportunities for physicians, such as Longhouse, experiential learning sessions, compassionate leadership, and cultural safety webinars, such as the one you're participating in today. This 5-part series will be focusing on cultural safety and trauma-informed practice based on the 4 elements of the medicine wheel. Today's session will focus on setting the tone and building trust. I am pleased to introduce Harley Eagle, our lead facilitator of the series. Harley is Dakota and a Ojibwe and a member of the Whitecap Dakota First Nation. As an Indigenous consultant and facilitator, he will take us through history, colonization, and a decolonized approach to trauma-informed care. We look forward to good conversation with you and also for being here today.
Well, thank you so much for that welcome, and thank you everybody for being here tonight. I'm going to start sharing my slides with you right now because it helps me to stay on track. And I know we have a limited amount of time. So I'm hoping that you can see my full slides. And so just once again, just thank you for being here for this session. It's kind of foundations to Indigenous cultural safety and connecting to trauma-informed practice and all of those things. And I just wanted to also provide my land acknowledgement for where I'm calling in from. I'm calling in from the unceded traditional territory of the Comox people, which includes the Petlatch, Ayexin, and Satlut people as well. I'm very, I am not from these territories. I'm Indigenous, but I'm originally from the prairies, from Saskatchewan. But I've lived on the island for about 25 years now, off and on. And I consider myself an uninvited guest into these territories. And the reason why I say that as an Indigenous person, I feel like I've fallen into the colonial patterns as well. We bought a home here, our family's bought a home here, and I haven't done the protocols to enter into the Comox people's territories in the way that we would have done, 100 years ago or a couple hundred years ago. But I am in relationship with the Comox people, and I strive to take direction from them. And when they call on me to participate in activities in the community, I certainly respond to that. And I learned so much from connecting with the leadership and with elders and with members of the Comox First Nation. And I want to say once again that I consider myself an uninvited guest, but not because the Comox people haven't shown me hospitality. They've been so amazingly inviting to me and connecting with me, and I feel very valued by them. But it's just a way of me acknowledging the colonial history that I carry and the colonial patterns that I carry, and I have to strive to be culturally safe myself as somebody who's not from these territories. And I just want to let you know what we're hoping to do in these sessions. We are, in response to the growing sense of urgency, if you will, around the truth and reconciliation calls to action. And certainly since the little ones started to be found on the sites of former residential schools, I think so many of us are feeling the urgency of this work. Certainly when we started to find the little ones, First off, with the 215 at Kamloops, that story broke our hearts. It's all of us, all across the nation and even other parts of the world noticed that and saw that and really felt, we felt something. We felt our hearts broken because of that story. Even though for many years, Indigenous people and survivors have been telling us that happened there, but when the evidence was found, if you will, and that story came forward, it was very difficult. And so there seems to be a growing urgency for this work, as well as the In Plain Sight report on Indigenous specific racism within the healthcare world. That's also brought a sense of urgency. And certainly we've been hearing time and time again from Indigenous people all across BC. And in my case, I hear a lot from rural settings of the need for physicians and healthcare providers to be trauma informed, to be culturally safe. That would help the situation. So we've been paying attention to those voices and striving to bring these kinds of understandings to the forefront in this work. And then also with the new practice standards that I'm sure many of you have seen and engaged with for physicians and surgeons that include the topics of Indigenous cultural safety and trauma-informed practice and anti-racism. So these are things that folks like yourself are being called upon to understand. And we've also heard the frustration from folks like yourself of, so where do you get that learning? You know, how do we engage in that learning if that's what's being called on us? And I really have to say, as a practitioner of this sort of material and content, that I think that there isn't enough opportunities. And so this, I think, is an attempt to bring some of those understandings to folks like yourself as well. And so for this session in particular, because it's a series, we're going to focus on what is cultural safety and cultural humility, and why is there a focus on Indigenous content and Indigenous people. So we'll explore that and explain why that's so important. And then also connecting Indigenous cultural safety and its learning to what we're noticing going on in our society as well. So addressing or connecting it to larger circumstances like systemic racism. And so many of us can feel that, and we know that that's an issue here. So we'll make those connections of how cultural safety can actually help for us to understand those situations and even start to address things like systemic racism as well. And I will also want to just say a quick word about our process. And I often attach it to the word protocols. You know, if you noticed, even in this session, Dr. Eatman provided us a welcome, you know, and there's been an acknowledgement of traditional territories. If we were in a big event right now, and a big public event, we would have had a welcome from the local First Nations, and that welcome probably would have included things like perhaps singing and words from elders and knowledge keepers and drumming, perhaps some sort of ceremony, and we probably would have shared in some food together, and certainly would have had an aspect of introductions. We can call all of those things the cultural customs or protocols that we do at the beginning of sessions. And so I got curious about the word protocol not that long ago, and I looked it up, and it actually comes from it's a word that references an important document like a treaty and that sort of thing. It can also reference the book binding process, you know, the process of putting a book together. And protocol in Latin actually translates to first glue. So it's that process of putting glue into the spine of a book to hold the pages and the covers together. So when I heard that, it made so much sense to me as an Indigenous person who knows that protocols are important. And the reason why they're important is that they help to activate the glue that holds us together. When we come into public settings, you know, these are the things that we are reminded of by elders and knowledge keepers, and by ceremony, and by the singing and the drumming that might be going on, or the prayers and all of that sort of thing. And the social aspects help us to remember of how to show up in a good way when we gather together. So I like to, and so you'll notice in our process throughout this series that we start with that. We want to activate the glue that holds us together. And as far as our workshop process goes, we want to make sure that you folks know that we're going to leave time at the end for dialogue and conversation. And so in the meantime, if you do have questions or thoughts, either jot them down and prepare to have some space at the end to address them, or to ask them, or to provide a reflection or a comment, or you can also put it into the chat. This wonderful team here, the supporting team here, will help to gather those, and we can address them at the end. And I also want to say that if there's something urgent, if something comes up for you in the moment, I really don't mind tending to things in the moment as well, because that's a part of dialogue. And I think we have to have more space for conversation and dialogue as well. So I really don't mind that. And the team here will get my attention if there's something that needs to be tended to in the moment. And I also want to just say about protocols and why they're important. is just thinking about all of the challenges that we're carrying right now. I mean, we're at the end of a long day, I'm sure, for many of you, and so we're tired. And we're also tired from those big things that are going on in our life, like the extreme challenges of the pandemic that many of you have been dealing so in depth with for such a long time. And we know that you're exhausted, and we know that the system is not as supportive as it could be. So we know, and many of us have been sick during this pandemic, or maybe we've lost loved ones during this time. So it's something that we're carrying, and then let alone the isolation that we've experienced through those layers are designed to keep us safe. But we also know that they have an impact on us when we haven't been able to connect socially like we're used to doing, and that's healthy for us. So, and that's an impact as well. And we're seeing more and more violence in the world, like even in Canada. So many terrible things seem to happen, and we watch the news. It's almost daily that we're seeing terrible things, shootings and killings that are happening all across the world, but also here in Canada as well. And we're seeing also an increase in war and the fear of war. There's been many wars going on for many years, but certainly in the last few months with what's happening in the Ukraine, that's weighing very heavy on our minds, and especially our young people, our loved ones, our young folks. They're really carrying this I think, in a deeply impacting way, as well as the climate crisis. All of us are worried about that, but it seems our younger generations are really worried about what does the future hold for them in terms of the violence and the fractured relationships and the wars and the climate crisis. So we are carrying a lot, and we're supporting others through this as well in our relationships. So it's good to know that. And then certainly the nature of this talk that we're providing, it can be difficult as well, because we're going to delve into the history of Canada from Indigenous perspectives, and maybe provide some information that you may not have known because it's been covered up for so long. So that can be particularly jarring as well. And certainly as we look at the impact of colonial history, for those of you that are Indigenous, this information can be difficult to hear as well, and unsettling. So just a reminder to please look after yourself, do those things that help you to stay present in terms of our time together. Yeah, just please look after yourself and tend to yourself if you're feeling those perhaps some triggering, or you're being unsettled. But just know that it's important to delve into that information, and there is hope as we start to delve into this. Creativity and innovation comes out of looking at this material and actually embracing it, as uncomfortable as it might be. So we'll find strength through looking at the difficult things as well. So be kind to yourself, and of course, be kind to others. And just know that this conversation that we're having now is we are responding in this moment to the TRC calls to action and the in plain sight report. So we can take heart that we are doing what we're supposed to be doing in terms of addressing these dynamics that we're learning more and more about, and the harm that they have caused. And then lastly, for this slide, I just wanted to let you know about a way that I think about this work in terms of learning and development. And maybe some of you have heard of this model called the 70-20-10 model of learning and development. And it's something that I think is really important to think about, like how do we actually go about increasing our knowledge and our understanding of Indigenous cultural safety and trauma-informed practice, and addressing racism and those sorts of things. So this model says that any new learning, whether it's a piece of equipment in the clinical setting or a big concept like truth and reconciliation or trauma-informed practice, any new learning should, at the formal level, so workshops like this and anything that takes you out of your regular workflow, should be at the 10% level. But I think in our fast-paced world and the way that we think about learning, we often put all of our eggs into the workshop basket. And I think that is a discredit to how we learn as human beings, because human beings actually need the opportunity to practice. And this model says that. So it says that 70% of this learning should be on the job. And I also add in our personal lives, those things that help us to continue on this journey of learning and make them relevant for each of us in our settings. And then the final 20% is learning from others. So who are the folks that get it already and that are operating in Indigenous culturally safe ways? How can we watch them? How can they be our mentors? maybe even assess us, and coach us, all of those sorts of things. So learning from others. And there's also the element of learning from each other as spending time talking about this and sorting through this together. And so hopefully at the end of our session today, you'll have that opportunity to hear from each other as well and learn from each other even in this setting. So please know that in doing this work, there's many of us that are trying to figure out, so what does that 70% look like? How do we support folks like yourself on the job, if you will, so that your learning continues even in those settings where they're most relevant, when you're interacting with the Indigenous people or trying to create that Indigenous or that culturally safe setting. So today in this workshop, we're scratching the surface, and we are in that 10% with elements of the 20% as well as we learn from each other. The way that we think about this work really is from a systems view. And so some people call it the 10,000-foot view or even the skydiver's view. Sometimes we also call it the balcony view. So anything that kind of gets you up to look at the big picture. We find that that's a very helpful process. And I call it the side of the hill view. So what we're doing from the side of the hill is looking at the history, looking downriver and to notice, what has occurred and how has it impacted our everyday reality right now. And so we can look straight down and notice what's going on in our present lives based on what's happened in the past. And then we can also start to look to the future. So our upriver. So what can we start to do to address and to change our course that might be helpful? And then there's also the element of locating ourselves within this scenery as well, or this view. And we'll do that in future sessions. We'll start to locate ourselves and try to figure out, so what is it that we can do from our locations in this grand scheme of things when we understand that grand scheme of things a little bit more. And this picture is reflective of the same point of view but the river's now been replaced by a road. And this is a metaphor for looking at the systemic nature of colonization and looking at our structures to try to understand, so how are they put together and how have they been influenced by colonialism? How have they been shaped by colonialism? And when we can understand that, then we can figure out, so what is useful and how can we use the structure to help us move to a different place? And maybe there's aspects of the system that we can try to transform and to change if it's not helpful and if it continues to perpetuate harm. And then this picture is referencing Mount Fuji in Japan. And the reason why I have this picture here is, as you listen to the story of colonization from Indigenous perspectives from this part of the world, if you are from another part of the globe, you might start to recognize some patterns, because oftentimes we notice that folks from other parts of the world find some familiarity with their own experiences of colonization as well. So your stories become very powerful in this moment. So if you are from another part of this world, your voices, your stories, your connections to what's happened here become very profound and very powerful. So I want to encourage you to share your stories as well of how you see this reflective of your own experience, perhaps of colonization. So I'm just going to say a few words about myself so you know a little bit more about me. As I mentioned, I'm Dakota and Ojibwe, or Anishinaabe is the political word that we use for Ojibwe-speaking people. And I'm originally from the prairies, as I've mentioned, and actually our people are originally from Minnesota. Minnesota in the United States, Minnesota is a Dakota word, and but we got pushed off our land in the 1870s. So we call it the ethnic cleansing of the Minnesota area of Dakota people. And my particular people came north of the border and settled in Canada, or put onto reserves in Canada. So as Indigenous people, we originated in other parts of our original homelands, but colonization has pushed us to where we presently are located and have been put onto reserves in Saskatchewan. And I am a child of survivors of residential school. Both my parents went to residential schools and also had many other experiences of colonization that have deeply impacted them, and then therefore have deeply impacted me. And they also taught me a lot of things culturally as well that are a source of strength for me. So they're not only survivors of residential school, they're also people that have taught me many things that are based on our cultural understandings. And so about 25 years ago, I got involved in the Indigenous rights advocacy along with my partner who was non-Indigenous. And so we worked for an organization that at a national and international scope looked at Indigenous rights advocacy and brought those stories forward to help people understand the dynamics of what Indigenous people all over the world were experiencing. That connected us to dismantling racism and other forms of oppression work. I became a trainer about 20 some years ago, and I continue to do training around anti-racism. And I even ran a program on anti-racism in the United States for a number of years. And then I also was involved in conflict resolution through something called restorative justice. And we use the circle process and talking circle process and healing circle process to work in a holistic way dealing with conflict that we found among people, among families, and even among communities. So I continue to do that work to this day. In fact, it's shaped the way that my career has gone, and I hold a Master's of Conflict Analysis and Management from Royal Roads University, where I also stay very connected to in many other ways as well. I just finished serving as the Indigenous Scholar in Residence for a Master's in Leadership with a health focus just last week. And also I needed to understand trauma. I needed to understand my own experiences and my parents' experiences and my people's experiences and how that's all connected together. And so that gave me this understanding or the need to pursue trauma-informed practice and moving it beyond just an individual's experience or just my experience, but connecting it to the system as well. And that's why it's called decolonized trauma-informed practice. And over 8 years ago, I was an Indigenous Cultural Safety Facilitator for Island Health here on Vancouver Island, which I did for a number of years. But in more recent years, I've moved beyond just healthcare, and now I'm a consultant in many aspects of society, including the child welfare system, many nonprofits, mostly working with families and children who have extra needs. As well as I do some work in the policing world and also for-profit companies as well. And I continue to do a lot of work in the healthcare world with many different projects all across BC. So I want to share with you now kind of the core of what this series is about. And I'm so thankful for the Indigenous physicians that I've been able to meet with over the last several weeks. That gave shape to this workshop series, and they really saw value in reflecting on and thinking about and talking about a symbol, an Indigenous symbol that helps us to think about this world and the way it functions. And so I'm going to share that symbol with you now. We've actually talked about it already with the medicine wheel. So this is the symbol, but I want to be clear about this. That this symbol comes from my particular culture as well as many other cultures, especially if the further east you go. But I want you to think about also that wherever you're located here in BC, the Indigenous people and the cultures that you connect with might not use this symbol. They might talk about what I'm going to talk about in different ways and use different symbols. And it's really important to connect with wherever you're located with the Indigenous people and the symbols they might use to describe very much the same thing that I'm going to describe now. But this symbol helps us to understand many different things. You know, if you think about the quadrants here, it can talk about the seasons. It can also talk about who we are as individuals, as human beings. We often talk about the top quadrant as our spiritual entity. So we have a spiritual entity. The next quadrant over is the emotional realm. And then the bottom quadrant is our physicality, our bodies. That can also mean our relationships and relationally too, how we see the world and how we are put together as human beings. And then the last realm there, the last quadrant is the intellectual realm. So that's how we think about this: the spirit, the emotions, the physicality or relational, and then the intellect. And so the teachings go or say that we have to pay attention to each of those quadrants if we want to walk in balance. So paying attention to those essential pieces of who we are as human beings. It can also describe a process. And this is where the work that I do around Indigenous cultural safety and working with folks in conflict. So this process basically says in the spiritual realm, that's where you set the tone. That's where you bring people together in a helpful way, where you do those protocols. You help to activate the glue that holds people together so that they can do the hard work that might be before them. So that's what you do in the spiritual realm. In the next realm over, in the emotional realm, that's where people can tell their stories. They can talk about the impact of conflict in their life and how it's shown up. And oftentimes those stories that they share are full of emotion and full of passion. And it's important to embrace that and allow that to be a part of the story because it's part of who we are. And then the bottom realm, the physical realm, that's where we start to explore. So what's the root? Like what brought us here? Let's dig down and peel back some layers to understand all of the dynamics that have brought us to this point. And then once you've done those 3 steps, then you can move into the intellectual realm where you can figure out, so what are we going to do about this? How are we going to, what kind of decisions should we make in order to move us to a better place? So this is a really helpful process. It's a community-based process. It's a way of bringing people together in a helpful way. But yet at the same time, we live in a society where there's another symbol in the Western society, another symbol that guides the way that we do our work. I'm going to share that symbol with you now. And this symbol is very common. And it's so common that it's become normalized. We don't even see it as a symbol anymore, and it's everywhere. Probably most of us in this moment are either wearing the symbol or we can see the symbol somewhere close by. Most of our homes will have the symbol somewhere up in the house, maybe in just about every room. Our workplaces often have this symbol in a very predominant place as well. And then even city squares might have this symbol up in a very predominant place as well. So it's a symbol that guides the way that we do our interactions. So this is the symbol that I'm talking about. The clock. This is often what guides the way that how we come together. And I'm sure for many of you, the physicians on this call, you have to pay attention to that, right? And so, and that's the important thing, is to pay attention to how much space, how much time that you have to interact. And so that's the challenge that we have. It's the challenge that we have in this moment of having an hour and a half to spend with one another. And I know all of us, I am directed by this clock, and it constructs the way that I think about life in general. But the problem is that it's a struggle to bring forward the medicine wheel and that's that community way of being when you have to pay attention to this limitation. Now, here's the exciting thing. I used to say for years, I've been saying, I don't know what the answer is. You know, what is our way forward? And sometimes I would say, I think the answer is both and. That how do we recognize that the limitations of the clock, but then how do we start to bring forward the elements of the medicine wheel and that community way of being with one another, that holistic way of being with one another. But now there's this something has come onto the scene in the last couple of weeks, and I'm referencing here the new fee model, the new funding model for physicians. I think there's an opportunity there for us to focus more on how do we be relational with one another if we don't have to pay as much attention with the clock. So I think there's a golden opportunity here, and I'm very excited that I can say that in this moment. It's the first time I've been able to say this in public. So I'm very excited for these moments, and I know that then, so how do we work with this concept of Indigenous cultural safety and trauma-informed practice, which benefits from that medicine wheel process, so much. We actually kind of need that. So I think there's an opportunity for us here with that new funding model, which will be in place in the new year. So I just want to mention really quickly here that the circle process, this way of being that references the medicine wheel, you can actually find this in many different Indigenous cultures that use the circle process, the talking circle process of coming together to be able to hear each other, to make sure that everybody's voice is heard. And the elders that we've worked with and the knowledge keepers that we've worked with for many years now have told us to never lose the circle process. I think it's a different way of coming together and interacting where we can actually hear from each other. So we've tried our best to do that. It's been a challenge in this virtual world to bring forward the teachings of the medicine wheel, but in most of our sessions, we're able to still in some way mimic the medicine wheel or the talking circle so that we have space to share. And that's why we want to spend time at the end bringing forward your comments and your thoughts as best we can in that limited amount of time that we have according to the clock. But the circle process is built on values, and this is the glue that I'm referencing that helps to hold us together. Really, that's what the circle process helps us to practice, and reminds us that we have to work from a place of humility, remembering that we're all connected and we actually need each other if we want to have a fulsome understanding of what we're up against. And hearing everybody's voice is very important, and that's really connected to the next value, which is respect, of taking the time to hear everybody. If you break down the word respect, it means re-looking, respect. So the circle helps us to hear from many different opinions and thoughts and experiences, ideas about whatever it is we might be trying to address. Integrity is walking in that principle, that ethical way that many of us carry teachings from, whether it's our faith traditions or the teachings of our families and those people that we respect have taught us how to hold ourselves with integrity, how to walk with principles and ethics. And so we bring that into the circle and say, let's remember that we've been taught how to do that, and let's make sure we activate that in the circle process. So holding ourselves with integrity and how we treat each other, so treating others with integrity. And we often say in the circle process, especially the stories that you tell, because sometimes in this circle that people will share something very deeply meaningful to them and maybe very personal. So we remind people to hold each other's stories with integrity, because those stories belong to you and they're not meant to be shared outside the circle. We'll learn from each other, and that's more than fine to share, especially what you're learning about yourself. But the details of what you share in the circle should remain in the circle. Generosity is having the kindness to share with somebody that might be in need, and also accepting kindness as well if you're in need, and having the ability to ask for help if that's what's required. But there's something even more with generosity that I want to bring forward, and it's found in the first part of that word, because the first part of generosity is the same first part in the word generations. So when I think about the connection to generosity and generations, it reminds me of that old story that says true kindness is when old men plant trees, knowing that they'll never experience the fruit or the shade of it, but they do it nonetheless. They plant the tree nonetheless, because the future generations will experience the benefit of it. And I think about that in terms of truth and reconciliation and the work that we're trying to do. Is we might not experience the fullness of our work, but that shouldn't stop us from doing what we can in this moment to create change that might take generations to evolve to a place where it's changing society. Courage, we ask people to show up in these settings from a place of vulnerability, and we know that that's scary. It's risky, and it's not an easy thing to do. So courage is required. When we ask people to show up from that deep place within themselves, from their heart. And courage, the root of the word courage in Latin and French, cœur, is heart. So we're asking people to show up from that place. Empathy is being able to stand with somebody or to sit with somebody that might be struggling in the moment when you recognize they're struggling. And the reason why you can recognize that they might be struggling is because you see a similarity to our own experiences, because we've all gone through heartbreak and loss in our lives. So we can notice that, we see that when somebody else because of our own experiences, and we know what that feels like to go through struggles. So we can go to somebody and say, I just want to let you know that you're not alone. I know you must be going through something, and I just want to let you know that I'm here for you if you would like. That's standing with somebody, that's walking with somebody that might be struggling, and to us, that's empathy. And the last value that we talk about is fortitude. And for this, we think about, or we break this word down into its root, and it's speaking to strength of mind. And it does take time. If we want to put our minds together to figure out a way forward, it does take time. And so that's why patience is often used to define fortitude. But there's also more to it as well, strength of mind. For me, and the work that we do with Indigenous cultural safety and connecting it to trauma-informed practice, we know that when trauma is unresolved and it's trapped within our body, it affects our nervous system, and it affects the way that we think. So really, strength of mind is also speaking to healing. Are we working with the traumas that we might be carrying to help to resolve them in our minds, so that our minds can be strong to figure out a way forward, that our minds can be settled because we're working on our own traumas, and we're showing up in different ways when we have that strength of mind. The last thing I'll say about those values before I address this slide is that those are universal values. Those don't just pertain to Indigenous people or to my culture. And that's what I love about them. They're universal values. They're human values that all of us can recognize. So now I just want to reiterate the role of vulnerability in this work, and that's why we try to provide space for people to have conversations. So I'm just going to share with you a quick story from somebody by the name of Brené Brown. Some of you probably know who she is. She's quite popular these days. She considers herself a shame researcher, and she's written several books on shame and vulnerability, and how, if you can address shame through vulnerability, how it makes you a better leader. It makes you a better partner. It makes you a better citizen. And that's the work that she does through her books and her work online. She even has some work on Netflix these days. A very popular person. So she shared a story a number of years ago when, remember when Black Lives Matters was big in the news about 8 or 9 years ago? And of course, during the pandemic, and 2 years ago was also big in the news. But back then, she told this story. And then she repeated this story, and Brené Brown is from the United States. So she repeated the story when the former president of the United States was inaugurated. So at that time, those 2 times, she said, the biggest issue facing the United States is the issue of racism. And I also say Canada as well. And then the current Black Lives Matters movement has shown us of just how global the phenomena of racism is, because people from all over the world were standing up in solidarity and also saying, here too, racism is a problem. So we know it's a global issue. It shows up differently in other parts of the world, but it's that notion of one group of people having power over others to the detriment of others. That's what racism is. So Brené Brown goes on to say that we're not having the deep conversations and dialogue to address systemic racism. Something always stops us. And she says, based on her research, she says it's shame. Because she says, if we want to talk about racism, we eventually have to talk about privilege. And that's what shuts down the conversation, because it's so uncomfortable to talk about that notion of having privilege in a structure of systemic racism. And I certainly get that as a male in this society, because I have come to realize that just how sexist this world is. And I started to realize, shown by many profound women and others in my life, of just how sexist this world is, and then how I carry those patterns, those privileges that are unearned. And that makes me uncomfortable when I think about that, when I notice those patterns. So I get that notion of not wanting to go there. And I've come to realize all of the strategies I have to shut those conversations down because it's uncomfortable. But Brené Brown says that it's so important to delve into those conversations. She also goes on to say about shame is that shame is held in place by 3 things, and it's very reflective of our work in cultural safety. So the first one is secrets. This holds shame in place. So if you cover up all of those things that we should have known about here in Canada, think about the little ones that are being found on the sites of former residential schools. That's a big secret that was kept hidden from us for so long. And just think about the power of the exposing of that. And then you can start to see of why that was kept secret. And even residential schools, we didn't know much about them until the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. And that's changed the way that we see this world. So you can see the power of keeping things secret. And there's so many others things that we need to know about in terms of Indigenous experiences here in Canada. And then the next one is silence. So this one has to do with the silencing of the voices and the stories, just like the little ones that are being found now. And that's a way of breaking the silence. And also the silence of our own voices when we don't know necessarily how to talk about these very difficult and uncomfortable issues. So even our own voices often become silent. And then the last one is judgment. And for this one, I think about the narratives, the stories that we do know, those common stories that have been told about Indigenous people that come from the media, and they come from Hollywood, and they come from those very common stories that are often shared around the kitchen table or around the living room or in workplaces. You know, those narratives, those that are based on stereotypes and myths and misconceptions, yet those form the common narratives of what we do know about Indigenous people and our relationship with the rest of Canada. And then they form the way we judge situations. When we see something amiss, these stories quickly come to our minds and we judge situations based on those narratives. So we need to disrupt those kind of patterns. And that's where Brené Brown goes on to say that vulnerability is the antidote to shame. So creating those spaces where we can have these deep conversations is so important and a vital part of Indigenous cultural safety. And so not only is it the antidote to shame, but it's also the gateway to creativity and innovation. If we can sort through these stories that are uncomfortable, it's also the birthplace of creativity and innovation. And Brené Brown also says joy. And I also say authenticity. There's so much that comes out of embracing this very difficult and uncomfortable history and current realities. That's why vulnerability is so important in this work. So cultural safety, let's take a look here now at cultural safety, what it is. And then right after that, we're gonna go into actually a process. I'm gonna explain to you a process of how we can embrace cultural safety. So cultural safety, it's a concept that came forward from Indigenous people about over 30 years ago now in New Zealand, Aotearoa, from the Maori people, so the Indigenous people of New Zealand, and primarily healthcare providers, primarily nurses brought this concept forward. And so primarily women, Indigenous women, who brought this concept forward over 30 years ago now, when they noticed that their people were being treated poorly and discriminated against in the healthcare system. Much the same findings as the In Plain Sight report. You know, that was happening 30 years ago in New Zealand. And so they said, so how do we create safety for our people when they're coming into the healthcare system? And then also they said further to that, when we try to engage with our colleagues around trying to bring some of these understandings, we're shut down. So how do we provide space so that Indigenous people can share with our perspectives on what's going on? So out of those conversations over 30 years ago came this concept of cultural safety. I'm going to share with you a definition. There's many definitions of cultural safety out there. I'd like to use this one as a starting point, and I often share others as well. But this one comes from First Nations Health Authority. They've been working really hard all across BC since 2013 on cultural safety. So this is their definition. It's an outcome based on respectful engagement that recognizes and strives to address power imbalances. So I hope you see there a connection to the medicine wheel, starting with how do we engage respectfully, setting the tone for entering in to look at our stories that talk about the power imbalances that we've experienced. So that's the emotional realm. And then we can start to look at it systemically as well, you know, that addresses power imbalances inherent in the healthcare system. So we're looking at the systemic nature of it, how it shows up. And the result is decisions that we can make and changes that we can make that results in an environment free of racism and discrimination. So this definition really fits that flow from Indigenous perspectives and teachings on how what we're trying to do with Indigenous cultural safety. But at the same time, this is an aspirational place. We have a long way to go to get there. So if it's an aspirational place and if it's an outcome that we're aiming towards, how do we get there? And that's where, once again, First Nations Health Authority has come up with a concept that helps us to understand how to do that. And that's in the form of cultural humility. So it's a value-based way of addressing a process or working with a process. So a process of self-reflection, looking within ourselves first to understand our personal and systemic, and then connecting it to our systems around us, those biases that we might carry that help to develop the respectful process that we referenced in the first definition. And then it's a part of learning, also learning from others. How do we build the skill to learn from others, especially in terms of their experiences? So that's cultural safety and humility defined and the origin stories. So now the learning process that we have found that is so helpful in this, and again, if you look at the literature of cultural safety, they often talk about it as the first step of building our knowledge and our understanding. I've actually added the word understanding to knowledge because knowledge can be kept academic. Understanding, if you look at the root of this word or the meaning of this word, it means in the midst of. So how do we find ourselves in the midst of this knowledge as well? So it goes beyond just an academic understanding. And then the next step is skills. So based on what we're learning, what kind of skills do we need? And this is where we can start talking about things like trauma-informed practice, when we recognize the impact of the traumatic experience of colonization, or anti-racism, when we start to understand the dynamics of racism, or mindfulness, or working within complexity. There's a whole myriad of skills that we can engage with that help us to navigate the past and present day realities. And then once we're firmly in those patterns of building our knowledge and understanding and working at our skills, that's when action emerges. The problem is that we've noticed in this work is that a lot of systems have jumped to action before they've built their knowledge and understanding and their skills. And we've seen lots of issues like that, especially after the TRC calls to action came out. Many systems jumped to action really quickly. And then 3-4 years later, they're coming to people like me and saying, but we did this 3 or 4 years ago, but it's not having any impact, or it's not having the impact that we thought it would. What did we do wrong? And what we end up saying is that maybe we didn't build our knowledge, understanding, and our skills first, and we jumped too quickly to action. And then we add a fourth step to all of this, and it becomes a first step. And that's building that container, setting the tone. How do we create the space so we can have these conversations that are often unsettling and uncomfortable? We have to create those dynamics where we can engage in a meaningful way and helpful way, and doing that work together becomes so important. So now this next portion, I'm going to go through what that learning process looks like. So we're going to start with knowledge and understanding. So we're going to look at the what we call the 4 main themes of the knowledge and understanding that we have found that's so helpful for us. And so the first theme that we like to recommend starting with is to look to the richness and the strength of Indigenous nations. People that have been here for thousands of years on this land, and our cultural practices and our teachings, even though they've been attacked and have been disrupted by colonization, we still have a lot of strength within our teachings and our languages and our ways of knowing and being. And this is a part of acknowledgement as well, those land acknowledgements that we do. The recommendation from elders and knowledge keepers around land acknowledgements is to move beyond just the few sentences that we say, to make it personal. Be on that journey of looking to the Indigenous people where you live and learning about that long history, and learning about the strength and what I call the genius and brilliance of Indigenous people, and add that to your land acknowledgement. That's a part of remembering and connecting to the richness and the strength of Indigenous nations. And we need that because the next 2 themes are really difficult. And the first one is to recognize the impact of the epidemics that have swept through us over the last 400 or 500 years that decimated our numbers. They estimate at the lower level of the population before colonization in the Western Hemisphere was somewhere between 100 and 190 million people. Over 18 million people north of Mexico before colonization. And with the wave after wave of epidemics, we were reduced to 10% of our numbers. And they say that was around 10% of the Earth's population during that relatively short period of time that died because of the epidemics. And that's a difficult thing to come to terms with that happened here, that the genocide of Indigenous people. And then the third theme is the impacts of all of the policies and legislation that have either were in place at one time and maybe they're not in place anymore, but they've had an impact. But then there's other policies that are still in place to this day. So some of the ones that were in place were things like the Royal Proclamation, and that was very powerful because the Royal Proclamation stated that the crowns of Europe needed to interact with Indigenous people nation to nation. That's why they wrote treaties. You write treaties between nations. So that's why there's many treaties all across the country in North America that were written with Indigenous people. But the problem is that they were quickly broken. and that created all kinds of detrimental impacts. And then things started to shift when Canada came into formation. It changed that nation-to-nation relationship to one of that Indigenous people became a federal responsibility. And then that gets changed even more with the inception of the Indian Act in 1876, which then changed us into what's often referenced as wards of the state. That we couldn't make decisions on our own, that all decisions were made at the federal level. And the Indian Act is still in place to this day for First Nations people. We have to remember that the Indian Act is known as one of the most racist forms of legislation that exists in the world. And we still have that in place here in Canada. That's what I mean about remembering that some of these policies are still in place. The reserve system as well, we've come to kind of normalize these things and we just accept them as the way we do things. Even the reserves, there's another word that we could use for First Nations reserves here in Canada, and that's apartheid. That's an apartheid system. It's a segregationist system that still exists in Canada to this day. We've normalized it and we've kind of romanticized it. And even us as Indigenous people, we call them our homelands or our home communities. But essentially, that's what the reserve system is here in Canada, is an apartheid system. And it's still in place here in Canada. So these are the unsettling things that we need, and the truths or the secrets that have been kept from us. This is why we talk about needing to set the tone and build a container that can hear these difficult things. And this is just a very short list of many of the different policies that were either in place for a time or that are still in place to this day. So you can read through this list, and you can get a doctorate just on understanding one aspect of this. So there's so much that we have to learn about in terms of the history and current reality of Canada from Indigenous perspectives, from that colonial understanding. So I'm not going to go into any of those. If you want to ask a question at the end about any of these policies, please bring that up at the end. And I'll do my best to share about them. The last statement there, illegal to hire lawyers, is there because it's connected with the last theme that I want to share with you. And that's the resiliency that Indigenous people have had. We want to remind people that we didn't just take all of this. Indigenous people were always pushing back and fighting back and calling into question when treaties were broken. And we would actually take the nation to court to say, you broke this treaty, so we're going to take you to court. And so we would hire lawyers to do that work for us. But then the way that the government pushed back on us through just before the Indian Act and then through the Indian Act was to make it illegal for us to hire lawyers. So then we thought, okay, well, we're going to work around that and we'll send our children to school and they'll become our lawyers. But then there's clauses within the Indian Act and some other acts called the Enfranchisement Act, which said if you did certain things as a First Nation person, like the whole criteria of things, if you did, you lost your status. And back in the 1870s, one of those things was going to higher education. So even when we sent our children to school to become lawyers to fight for us in court, then they lost their status. And in the eyes of the government, they were no longer part of our community. And we couldn't even hire our own people, our own children. There was always this pushback to the resistance that we showed back and forth. And that's built up resiliency within us. And then also all of the harm that comes out of that, we've recognized that we need to heal because we continue to lose our people as well because of the onslaught of colonization that continues to this day. But there's many of us that are looking to what my daughter calls intergenerational strength. How do we connect to our languages and our culture and to the to that resiliency that helps to build up our strength when we connect to that. So we have to understand, and this is how this is all connected to trauma-informed practice. We have to understand trauma because all of those experiences in those two middle themes have been traumatic for us. So we have to understand, so what is psychological trauma? What is trauma? And so we do a lot of work around building that understanding. And this is the words of Dr. Judith Lewis Herman, who wrote a seminal book called Trauma and Recovery, that it's damage to the mind, as a result of those overwhelming experiences that our bodies are so overwhelmed that we can't deal with that very stressful experiences, and that damages our minds and our bodies. Peter Levine says trauma originates as a response in the nervous system and does not originate in the event. We have to remember that it's impacted individuals in terms of their nervous systems. And then Dr. Gabor Mate says trauma is not about what happened to you. Trauma is what happened inside of you as a result of what happened to you. So we have to understand trauma. And then our elders say, and our knowledge keepers remind us of that trauma creates an imbalance of our body, minds, and spirit. So it disrupts that medicine wheel that we talked about of how to walk in balance. Trauma disrupts that, and especially disrupts our spirit. And it takes a lot of energy to be a survivor, so it depletes our life energy as well. And then it's interconnected with our bodies. When you're carrying, levels of adrenaline and cortisol because you're living with unresolved trauma, it starts to affect your organs and other parts of your body, and they start to break down. And then there's the intergenerational aspect. If we don't deal with it, if we don't work at it, we pass those traits on to the future generations. So now we're moving into the skill portion of Indigenous cultural safety. With this example, trauma-informed practice is one of those skills that's so important in this work. So I'll let you read the definition here, but it's a shift in our worldview to understand the prevalence of unresolved trauma in society. And I do have to say this, that the people that came up with trauma-informed practice were therapists and counselors and practitioners. They weren't focusing on Indigenous people. They were focusing on all of society. They recognize that just how prevalent trauma is throughout society, not just Indigenous people and other marginalized people. So what we often say, we render down trauma-informed practice to a motto that says, rather than something is wrong with someone, work from the understanding that something has happened to them. And so, and all of this, and we're going to talk about this in the next session that we have, and then the third session as well. We're going to talk about the aspect of trauma and how it affects us, and then how can we show up differently? How can we work at these aspects within us? And this is a skill. So we often talk about self-regulation and co-regulation. And I just want to say this too, that I do a lot of work around racism, or addressing racism and anti-racism. And right now, the leading edge of anti-racism work is around somatics. It's moving away from just an academic understanding of systemic racism and recognizing that we've all been impacted by a system of racism in our society, and it shows up in our bodies. And so there's a lot of work that's being done now to talk about the somatic experiencing of systemic racism on all of us, because all of us are impacted by it. So we'll talk more about that in the next sessions. So the next skill that I want to share with you, and so what I'm going to do here is this is kind of where I'll end our session here, but we call this, I'm going to peel back some layers for us, and this is a skill that we think is really helpful and really needful for this work. And so we call it expanding our narratives. One of the videos that we often use in our work is called The Danger of a Single Story, and maybe some of you have seen it. And I'll share these resources with you as well. We're gonna send out a resource document in the coming days that supports this workshop. So you'll have videos and connections to many of the things that I've talked about here. One of them will be a video called The Danger of a Single Story by Chimamanda Adichie. It's a TED Talk. And she talks about how it's so dangerous if we just have a narrow perspective on anything. And so we call this the skill of expanding our narratives. That we have to move beyond those narratives that I spoke about, that Brené Brown talks about, holding shame in place, that have us judging a situation based on narrow narratives or a single story. So there's a skill that's required to expanding our narratives. And so narrow narratives create and maintain stereotypes. And even if there's an element of truth within stereotypes, there's still an incomplete understanding. So we're not digging down and far enough to understand what's at the root of this problem. So it's a skill to be able to dig down into those roots. And also there's a danger if we only focus on the disparities and the trauma of Indigenous people. So we want to understand, so why did these traumatic experiences happen? And what kind of systems were in place that created these experiences for Indigenous people? So that's part of expanding our stories, to try to connect it to the power imbalances found in colonial institutions. Because if we don't do that, then we can end up pathologizing Indigenous people. And we don't want to do that. We want to see the systemic nature of colonization as well. And so we even applied this to the story of colonization. And here's why. You know, if we look at the last 400 or 500 years, or only the last 400 or 500 years of colonization here in North America, it's going to leave us at either a very bitter and angry place. And that's what happened to me as an Indigenous person. When I only looked at the last 400 or 500 years, it made me very angry. And rightly so, because so many terrible things have happened to us as Indigenous people and continue to happen. Or if you're of European descent, it's going to leave you at a place of being carrying shame and guilt, and that will leave you in a quandary as well. So we recognize that we had to expand our understanding of that as well. So we call this the older story of colonization. So what we did is that we actually applied that motto of trauma-informed practice to the story of colonization. Because again, if you only look at the last 400 or 500 years, and you look at all of the terrible things that happened, it'll leave you at a place of saying, what was wrong with European people when they came to these shores? Rather than saying, so what happened to European people to bring them to these shores? You see the difference there in applying that model? So that's what we did with the story of colonization. So what we did is we jumped back 1,000 years ago. We wanted to understand, so what happened in Europe? So we jumped back 1,000 years ago and we noticed that the history books showed us that the indigenous tribes of Europe were being colonized at that time by the Holy Roman Empire. And I want to say this too, that this was just the one area that we looked at. We could look at other parts of the world in different time eras and see very similar patterns of colonization going on. Even the Holy Roman Empire too, there's a longer and older history to what they were doing in other parts of the world as well. But for the purposes of this story, we looked at 1,000 years ago, and we noticed how, especially in the eastern part of Europe, the indigenous people were being colonized at that time in very brutal and terrible ways as well. And so then we noticed that for several hundred years, the colonial process was ongoing for those formerly indigenous people, and they were starting to be colonized and brought into that system as well. So they lived with that for a couple hundred years, but then they started to push back against the Holy Roman Empire, and they started to reform themselves. And this is where a lot of the countries that we know today of Europe came out of that time as they reformed themselves. But the problem is that they reformed themselves in the pattern of their oppressor. And a lot of them even incorporated the Catholic Church as part of their structure as well, just as the Holy Roman Empire did too. And so when you live in that sort of society and you're mimicking the colonizers, then you're doing the same thing to one another. You're fighting against each other. You're trying to get more land, trying to get more resources. And this is where you also see these nations sending out explorers, sending out people to look for new trade routes and to look for new sources of resources. So now we're in the 14th century, and this is when people like Christopher Columbus were sailing the ocean blue, and that's what brought them to our shores with that sort of way of life, if you will, that worldview. So what we like to say is that the once colonized became the colonizer through that process of their own colonization. And one of the books that we look to says it this way: Europe, the initiator of one of the world's major processes of conquest, colonization, and cultural transformation, was also the product of one. The colonized became the colonizer. So now we recommend that people kind of dwell there and think about that for a while, and think about your own history. If you're of European descent, think about how maybe your ancestors were impacted in that way. And a lot of times we don't think about that, but we know that that's important in this work to help us to understand the power dynamics in all of this. And so now I want to show you, as we peel back a couple more layers here, of how this becomes institutionalized. So how does this process of colonization become normal? How does it become a part of the structure of our society? So, because we often end up thinking that, well, it's just human nature, it's just survival of the fittest, but we want to show how it becomes a part of the structure. One of the questions that I often ask, and maybe some of you have heard of this, it's called the doctrine of discovery. If you remember a few months ago when the Pope was here in Canada, I don't know if you saw in the news, but many Indigenous people were standing up and saying, you have to do something about the doctrine of discovery. You have to rescind the doctrine of discovery. So this is what they were talking about and why it's so important for them to talk about, or it's so important to talk about. In fact, it's so important that the TRC calls to action call out the doctrine of discovery 3 different times in their calls to action. So this is what it is. The doctrine of discovery was a concept that was used to justify European sovereignty over indigenous peoples and lands. And oftentimes the Latin byline to the doctrine of discovery is terra nullius, empty land. That's what terra nullius means. So that's what they were trying to show, that there weren't people on these lands. There weren't 190 million people in the Western Hemisphere, that the land was empty. That's what this concept did. And so how did they do that? This is how it was put together. So the doctrine of discovery is a series of papal bulls, and which were edicts from the Catholic Pope. And so just remember that back in the 14th century and a few hundred years later, the Catholic Church was a big part of the power structure. They had power all across those nations. So very much a lot of power dynamics there. And so the reason why this came into being was because of a problem. And that problem was when Christopher Columbus came to these shores and found new sources of resources and new land. They had a problem. And that problem was Indigenous people. And so how did they solve this problem? Christopher Columbus goes back to Spain, tells of these lands full of riches and the people. And so in order to solve that problem of the people, one of the first papal bulls, one of the first edicts in this doctrine of discovery said something like this: if you encounter people on those shores, if they're not Christians and you don't recognize their form of governance, then they're not fully human. So that's the moral way of dealing with that problem, was that they eliminated the moral problem through that edict from the power structure of the Catholic Church by saying that Indigenous people were not fully human if they weren't Christians and you didn't recognize their form of governance. So that's the moral dilemma solved through that. And then that allows you to do terrible things to the people, it allows you to enact genocide, and allows you to enact slavery on whole groups of people, which impacted Africa as well. And so how does it become legal? Now you have to jump forward 200 years later to see how this becomes legal. And once again, 200 years later, you're in the young country of the United States now. And you have Indigenous people once again standing up and saying, who gave you sovereignty over our lands? We don't agree that you have sovereignty. We're going to take you to court. And so this is what happened when they took them to court. This is where you first heard the phrase doctrine of discovery used, because they wanted to show how they had international law on their side, how the US government had international law on their side. So they collected all of those papal bulls and they said, we have international law on our side because of this doctrine of discovery. So then you have to understand what international law is. Basically, it's precedent. How have nations been interacting? There isn't a book somewhere that says this is right or this is wrong. It's simply how have nations interacted? What treaties and agreements have they written? That becomes international law. So that's why they collected all of those papal bulls to say, we've been interacting in this way for 200 years. We have international law on our side. And the Supreme Court of the United States agreed. And that's how colonialism becomes legal for all of the colonial nations to this day, including Canada. So the last layer that I want to peel off for us, and then I'm going to open it up for conversation. So how does racism fit into all of this? So the rise of the ideology of racism, because it's a fairly new concept, that we're divided by the color of our skin and that sort of thing, because we're the human race, in reality. So once again, Indigenous people are standing up or they're disrupting that notion of who is fully human by some of them becoming Christians. And some of them even started to mimic the form of governance and the ways of being of European people. So now you have your old problem back again. If you still want sovereignty over their land, you still want to see humans as a resource, you have to have something that backs that up. And so they needed that reasoning. And so they turned to this guy, and I'm sure many of you know who Carl Linnaeus is. He's the guy that came up with the classification system of plants and animals that we still use to this day. So they turned to him and his peers to support the notion that there's a hierarchy to the so-called races of human beings. If you read his diary, Carl Linnaeus, he kind of says he doesn't want to do it because he says we're already classified, we're the human race. But because there was this pressure to get this ideology out there, he and other scientists started to work on this and started to put forward this theory. So they developed this theory around the four primary races of human beings, tried to do all kinds of studies and research to show that there was a difference in morality, character, and that sort of thing. They never could prove four. So they went to eight. They couldn't prove eight, and 16 they couldn't prove. And it went on and on. They never could prove that there's any difference between us beyond our skin color, hair texture, eye shape. In terms of our morality, our intelligence, our character, there's no difference. In fact, there's more difference within groups than there is between groups. But yet the ideology served the purpose that said that there's indeed a hierarchy to the races. So what we say in this is that race is a myth, but racism is real. So that power continues to this day, and it shows up in our society. So what we try to do in this work is to move beyond a definition of racism that only talks about it as individuals and those ugly interactions between individuals. We want people to understand that it's much more than that. That racism is the power to design and maintain a system of complex social and political gears and levers. I'll let you read the rest there. But it's the Indian Act. It's the doctrine of discoveries. It's the reserve system. It's the banning of our spirituality. It's the Indian hospitals. It's the 60 scoop. It's all of those things that were put in place within our society. And the problem is when that becomes legitimized in the structures of our society, it becomes normalized. And it shapes the way that we see each other, and it shapes the way that we walk in this world. And then it allows for us to continue to treat each other in these terrible ways, as if individuals and the environment are lesser or more value than others. So this is where we want to get to try to figure out, so what do we do about this? We have to start addressing the power dynamic. And oftentimes we use the metaphor of an iceberg, that we have to move beyond just the tip of the iceberg understanding in terms of racism as those ugly interactions between individuals. We have to get into the water and see how those power dynamics, legislations and policies are still in place to this day, and how they've shaped the way that we see each other as well. And so this is the last slide I'm going to share with you. This is where we really feel that we have to get to in doing this work of Indigenous cultural safety, is to recognize how we're all tied up in this colonial milieu, if you will, that's been so damaging to all of us. It's been so damaging to all of us for generations, even older than 400 or 500 years. So what the quote from somebody that said this, Lila Watson, that said this phrase, but she always says, this came from a collective. She said the words, but there were many of them that worked from this understanding in Australia. So it says, if you've come here to help me, you're wasting your time. But if you've come because your liberation is bound up with mine, then let us work together. That's where we really feel we need to get to in doing this work of Indigenous cultural safety. It's not about helping Indigenous people. It's about recognizing how we're all caught up in the systemic nature of oppression and colonization and systemic racism. And when we have that understanding, then we'll work together to figure out a way forward. So that's all I'm going to share with you for today, and ask for your reflections and comments and questions. Next month, I'm going to have a guest speaker with us who's going to speak to from an Indigenous patient's perspective, and also a practitioner of Indigenous cultural safety. And she's going to speak to us of her experiences and how that works within our physiology as well. So that'll be next week. But I just want to open it up now for comments, reflections, and questions. And I'm going to stop sharing my screen now. We have about 15 minutes with one another. So any comments, any reflections? Any thoughts? And even if anybody wants to share what they're feeling in this moment as well, what might be coming up for you, what you're noticing in yourself. I see Leslie's hand.
Yeah, thanks, Harley. I learned so much during the presentation. It was so thoughtfully put together. Thank you. My question is, when you think about decolonizing a workplace, what is it that you start with? Like, how do you even, it just seems so big, you know? So, you know, and I know it's not a linear process by any, you know, stretch of the imagination, but would just be interested in your comments, your thoughts about that.
Yeah. Well, I think, you know, when we do this work of Indigenous cultural safety and we start to examine racism even deeper, we get to this place of looking at the characteristics within society that a system of racism has created. There's this wonderful author. Her name is Temu Oken, and she wrote a book called "The Emperor Has No Clothes: How to Teach Race and Racism to People That Don't Want to Hear It." It's a wonderful title. But she came up with an article, or she wrote an article over 20 years ago now. It has a difficult name, so I'm going to say the name, but just recognize that you might feel some unsettling when I say the name. So the article is called "White Supremacy Culture Brief." She's not talking about white supremacists. She's talking about how that ideology that whiteness is at the top of the list, and how that's shows up in characteristics within our society. But you should read the document, and we can share it as a resource as well. But we often do a lot of work building up to that. But I wanted to share with you this because I think it really fits well. But she talks about things like perfectionism and sense of urgency and worship of the written word. If it's not written down, it doesn't exist. There's a whole list of other ones. The right to comfort. There's about 8 or 10 of them that she's realizing of what are, and you start to recognize, you start to see them not only in your structures but in ourselves too. We often beat ourselves up, or we worry that people will see us as, if we make a mistake, that we are a mistake, rather than, I'm just human, I made a mistake. But our system tells us there's no room for mistakes. So it's just a really profound article that helps us to see those patterns within our society. So when you talk about, creating environments or structures, I think we have to start addressing those characteristics. The wonderful thing about the article too is that she provides antidotes. So what can we start to do differently as well? So it's a really powerful document. I carried that document around with me for years, like literally in my backpack, in my briefcase. I keep it close by now, but not to thrust into people's faces, but I use it as a mirror. Because as an Indigenous person, those characteristics show up in me as well. I'm told that I have to fit this structure, so they show up in me. And so I started to realize how I've been impacted by that. So that's another piece of all of this for your question is I think when we can look inward, and that's why cultural humility is about being self-reflective, recognizing those patterns within ourselves and figuring out how we can start to address them, helps us to show up differently with others in those structures. And then once there's a few of us doing that kind of work, then we start to figure out a way forward of changing the structures of our workplace environment.
Thank you.
Yeah, I just see Corey's words there. Thank you for saying that. Like I said, we've been working a lot more on somatics, understanding the impact of these structures, the impact of white supremacy culture on all of us. It's hard to put into words, and that's why we often focus on, what are you feeling? How is it showing up in your body? There's another wonderful book that we can share with you called My Grandmother's Hands, written by a gentleman by the name of Resma Menachem, who's a therapist. And he talks about that, how he's Black, but he talks about how that older story of colonization that we talk about has impacted, folks that are racialized as white, and how that's carried within our bodies. So oftentimes we don't have the words to express what's going on inside of us because we're not nurtured in how to do that in this fast-paced society. So it's bringing that kind of awareness in, and then seeing how you carry those things is so important in all of this work. I think we have to move beyond keeping or having this as an academic understanding, but how do we feel? And one of the definitions around cultural safety is feeling, and I really like this definition because all of them talk about feelings. I'll share it with you in a future session, but it talks about, has your client, your patient, the person you're interacting with, have they felt valued? Have they felt understood? Have they felt like their identity is important? All of these things, but they all start with feeling. Have they felt that? It reminds me of that saying that says, people won't always remember what you said to them, but they'll remember how you made them feel. And I think that's what we can do as healthcare practitioners, is work on our stuff so that we show up in such a way that people feel our authenticity and our humanness. Yeah, I'm just reading through the chats as well. Sorry if I missed anybody's hand that's up. I'd love to hear some more thoughts from you, and I'll keep scanning the chat as well.
I had just written this in the chat because sometimes it's easier for me to write things than say them. But I was just saying, thanks so much for your teachings, and like not only what you were saying, but also how you were saying it. I found just the process of how you were talking about things was also a teaching in and of itself. And one of the things, there's so many things that could be taken away from the time today, but one thing that I was thinking about when you were talking about the process of the medicine wheel being a process, not just a symbol, and really thinking about, in my experience with my medical training, really being the way that I have been taught to approach the encounters, really sort of jumping to the kind of cognitive and intellectual part right away, and feeling a lot more comfortable operating out of that domain, like not the somatic domain, really like the mental space, and how different that might look, or like how would that look to go through more of that process you mentioned of sort of opening the space in a way where you're kind of that spiritual part where you're sort of creating the space, and then kind of moving through the emotional and the physical domains first. And like, what would the intellectual part look like? How would that be different if you came at it after moving through those other kind of steps? And like, what would that look like to incorporate that, like in the system we work in? Like how could we move in that direction? So that's something I'm going to be thinking a bit more about. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much, Moira. Yeah, it has me thinking about regulation and co-regulation, like just the simple, I shouldn't use the word simple because sometimes it takes skill building and practice to be able to regulate yourself, but it's so much about how do you breathe, what do you pay attention to, and it moves beyond academic. It's paying attention to how your body is, but if you can enter into a space regulated, you help to co-regulate the other person as well, because they're nervous as heck as well, right? So if you can enter into that, and that's that kind of spiritual realm, if you will, the setting the tone, is so much a part of that. So sometimes I think if I can use this word, that it's a simple approach when we can pay attention to our bodies and what's natural to all of us. But I think we've been trained in this fast-paced Western world of how to be unnatural, but that's become normalized, right? Is basically being unnatural with one another. It's interesting. One of the speakers that we'll bring in, not for next session, but the next session, is Dr. Ral Gupta, and he does a lot of work around somatics and polyvagal theory. And we were at a conference together, and he shared his beautiful talk with people, and our knowledge keeper came up later and said, everything you said is really good. We've known this for thousands of years as Indigenous people, and ancient cultures from all over the world, knew that this is so important to pay attention to ourselves holistically. Any other thoughts, comments, questions? Somebody's asking about a book. Yeah, that's a good question. Maybe maybe we need to write a book that helps that. And that's a part of that 70% that I spoke about, the 70-20-10. You know, what kind of resources can we have that we can quickly access? It's a wonderful question. And I would say that you know, there's so many good books out there, but a lot of the books that I focus on are kind of the breaking of the secrets and breaking the silence. Like there's a wonderful book called 21 Things You Should Know About the Indian Act, written by Bob Joseph. You know, that's just helps you to expose those secrets. So yeah, so I'm not sure if there's one good book. I mean, there's another one called Braiding Sweetgrass. It's written as an Indigenous woman, from an Indigenous woman's perspective, and a scientist, a botanist way of seeing the world. So she brings in science and connects it with Indigenous ways of knowing and being as well. So that's a pretty good one. Yeah. I realize we just have a minute left with one another.
Dr. Eatman, would you like to hop in?
Sure. Yeah. Thanks so much, Harley. I really appreciated how you made space for people to feel uncomfortable, but without any shame. I think that's really important when it comes to cultural safety work, is just moving past our shame and working through our shared history. And I think you really highlighted that nicely. Like we're all have a colonial history, and it's certainly impacted all of us in a negative way. And now it's up to all of us to work together through it. So I just want to thank you again for your words and the space that you were able to hold for this evening. So thank you so much.
You're very welcome. And thank you, everybody, for being here tonight. And we'll see you at the next session.
Thanks, everyone. An opportunity to reflect will be made available to you after the webinar ends, and make sure you sign up for the next sessions. Good night, everyone.
Good night. Thank you.